The dust clouds rose like angry spirits from the Arizona desert floor as the wagon train lurched to a violent halt. Keiko Tanaka pressed her face against the wooden slats, her dark eyes scanning the horizon, where armed men on horseback emerged from behind towering red rocks. The year was 1885, and the American frontier was still a lawless expanse where human lives were traded like cattle. "Everyone out, now!" The gruff voice of wagon master Bill Crawford cut through the desert air like a whip crack. Keiko's hands trembled as she clutched the small bundle containing everything she owned in this foreign land. Around her, other Japanese immigrants, men, women, and children who had crossed an ocean seeking opportunity, stumbled from the cramped wagon beds onto the scorching sand. The gold prospectors who had purchased their labor contracts sat atop their horses like vultures, their weathered faces showing no mercy under wide-brimmed hats. These were men hardened by years of chasing dreams in unforgiving mountains, men who saw human beings as nothing more than tools to extract precious metal from stubborn earth. "This one's too small," growled a bearded man named Dutch Morrison, pointing at Keiko with a dismissive wave. "She won't last a week in the mines." At barely 5 feet tall and weighing less than 90 pounds, Keiko had already endured months of grueling travel from her homeland. Her family had sold everything to pay for her passage to America, believing the promises of steady work and fair wages. Instead, she found herself trapped in a system that differed little from slavery. "She'll work the sluices," Crawford replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "Small hands are good for sorting through gravel. Besides, Morrison, you already got your money's worth with the others." He gestured toward the group of Japanese men being herded toward a separate wagon, their faces resigned to whatever fate awaited them in the gold fields. The transaction was completed with the exchange of crumpled bills and a handshake that sealed Keiko's destiny. As Morrison's wagon disappeared into the desert heat with its human cargo, she found herself alone with Crawford and 2 other prospectors heading toward a different mining camp deeper in Apache territory. The journey to the Copper Creek mining operation took 3 days, through terrain that seemed designed to break both spirit and body. Keiko rode in the back of a supply wagon, her slight frame bouncing against sacks of flour and mining equipment as the wheels found every rock and rut in the primitive trail. The men barely acknowledged her existence except to throw her scraps of food and bark orders about staying quiet. On the second night, as they camped beneath a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch, Keiko overheard the men discussing the dangers ahead. Apache raids had increased in recent months, they said, as the native tribes fought desperately to protect their ancestral lands from the endless stream of miners and settlers. The military presence was minimal in this remote region, leaving the mining camps vulnerable to attack. "That's why we need every hand we can get," Crawford muttered, stoking the campfire with a stick. "Even if some of them ain't worth much." His eyes fell on Keiko, who pretended to sleep while listening to every word. She had learned enough English during her journey to understand that her life held little value to these men, beyond the labor she could provide. The Copper Creek camp sprawled across a narrow valley like a festering wound in the earth. Dozens of tents and crude wooden structures housed nearly 200 miners, all driven by the same desperate hunger for gold that had drawn men to this desolate place for over a decade. The sound of pickaxes against rock echoed from dawn to dusk, punctuated by the occasional blast of dynamite that sent birds scattering from their perches in the sparse desert vegetation. Keiko was assigned to a tent with 3 other women, 2 Mexican immigrants, and an Irish widow named Bridget O'Malley, who had followed her husband's dream to America, only to watch him die of lung fever in these very mountains. The women worked the sluices, standing knee-deep in icy mountain water for 12 hours a day, sifting through tons of gravel and sand in search of the golden flakes that might earn them a few cents toward their freedom. "Don't expect any kindness here," Bridget warned on Keiko's first morning, her Irish accent thick with bitterness. "These men see us as less than human. They'll work us until we drop, then replace us with fresh bodies from the next wagon train." Her words proved prophetic, as Keiko quickly discovered the brutal reality of life in the mining camp. The work was backbreaking and dangerous. The mountain streams that fed the sluices were fed by snowmelt, keeping the water temperature just above freezing even in summer. Keiko's hands, already soft from her previous life as a merchant's daughter in Osaka, quickly became raw and bleeding from the constant exposure to cold water and sharp gravel. Her back ached from bending over the wooden troughs, and her legs went numb from standing in the frigid stream for hours without rest. Food was scarce and of poor quality, mostly beans, hardtack, and occasional strips of dried meat that tasted more like leather than beef. The miners received larger portions, but the women were given barely enough to sustain life, let alone the energy required for their demanding labor. Keiko's already slight frame began to waste away as weeks turned into months. The camp's isolation made escape impossible. They were surrounded by hundreds of miles of desert and mountain wilderness, with the nearest town a week's journey away. Even if someone managed to flee, the Apache presence in the surrounding territory made survival unlikely for anyone unfamiliar with the harsh landscape. The miners knew this and used it to their advantage, maintaining control through fear and desperation rather than physical restraints. As autumn approached, bringing shorter days and colder nights, Keiko's health began to deteriorate rapidly. The combination of malnutrition, exhaustion, and exposure to the elements had weakened her immune system to the point where a simple cold could prove fatal. She developed a persistent cough that racked her frail body, and her hands shook so violently from the cold water that she could barely hold the tools required for her work. "You're falling behind, girl," Crawford snarled one morning as he inspected the previous day's gold recovery. "Your sluice produced half what the others did. Maybe you need some motivation." He reached for the leather strap he used to discipline workers who failed to meet his expectations, but Bridget stepped between them. "She's sick," the Irish woman said firmly. "Can't you see she's barely standing? Give her a day to recover and she'll be back to full production." Crawford's eyes narrowed as he considered the request. Sick workers were a liability, but replacing them was expensive and time-consuming. "One day," he finally agreed. "But if she's not pulling her weight by tomorrow evening, she'll find herself working the night shift in the deepest tunnel. And we both know what happens to workers who go down there." His threat hung in the air like smoke from the campfire. The deep tunnels were notorious for cave-ins and toxic gases that had claimed dozens of lives over the years. That night, as Keiko lay shivering in her thin blanket, she made a decision that would change everything. She could not continue living this way, slowly dying in service to men who saw her as nothing more than a tool to be used and discarded. If she was going to die, it would be on her own terms, seeking freedom rather than accepting slavery. The opportunity came sooner than expected. 3 days later, as the first snows began to dust the mountain peaks, a commotion erupted from the direction of the main trail. Riders were approaching the camp at full gallop, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim with urgency. The lead rider, a cavalry sergeant named Murphy, brought news that sent a chill through the entire camp. "Apache war party hit the Silver Dollar mine yesterday," he announced to the gathered miners. "Killed 12 men and burned everything to the ground. They're moving this way, and we don't have enough soldiers to protect every camp in the territory." The implications were clear. Copper Creek was on its own, and an Apache attack could come at any time. Crawford immediately began organizing the camp's defenses, assigning armed men to watch posts around the perimeter and moving the most valuable equipment to a central location where it could be better protected. In the chaos of preparation, few people noticed when a small figure slipped away from the main group and disappeared into the gathering darkness of the desert night. Keiko had taken only what she could carry, a water bottle, some dried food stolen from the camp stores, and a worn blanket that might provide some protection against the cold. She had no clear destination in mind, only the desperate hope that death in the wilderness would be preferable to the slow destruction of her spirit in the mining camp. The desert at night was a different world from the scorching wasteland of daylight hours. The temperature dropped rapidly once the sun disappeared behind the mountains, and the silence was broken only by the distant howl of coyotes and the whisper of wind through the sparse vegetation. Keiko walked steadily southward, guided by the stars her father had taught her to read during their fishing trips in Osaka Bay. By dawn, she was miles from the camp, but her strength was already failing. The combination of her weakened condition and the physical demands of walking through sand and rocky terrain had pushed her body beyond its limits. Her water was nearly gone, and the small amount of food she had brought would last perhaps another day if she rationed it carefully. As the sun climbed higher, bringing with it the punishing heat of the Arizona desert, Keiko sought shelter beneath a cluster of rocks that provided minimal shade. Her breathing was labored, and dark spots danced at the edges of her vision, clear signs that her body was beginning to shut down from dehydration and exhaustion. It was there, as she lay dying beneath the merciless desert sun, that her life took an unexpected turn. The sound of approaching hoofbeats caused her to lift her head, expecting to see Crawford and his men coming to drag her back to the camp. Instead, she found herself looking up at a lone rider whose appearance was unlike anyone she had encountered in this harsh land. The man sat astride a magnificent paint horse, his long black hair braided with leather and adorned with eagle feathers that caught the morning light. His face was weathered by years of desert sun, but his dark eyes held a depth of wisdom and compassion that seemed impossible in this brutal landscape. He wore traditional Apache clothing mixed with pieces of cavalry uniform, a combination that told a story of survival and adaptation in a world where his people were being systematically destroyed. This was Thomas Crow Feather, though he had been known by many names throughout his 43 years of life. Born to the Chiricahua Apache, he had watched his tribe's traditional way of life disappear as miners, soldiers, and settlers claimed their ancestral lands. His wife and 2 children had died in a cavalry attack on their village 5 years earlier, leaving him alone in a world that seemed determined to erase every trace of his people's existence. Thomas dismounted slowly, his movements careful and deliberate as he approached the dying woman. He had been tracking the mining camp for days, gathering intelligence about their defenses and routines, when he spotted the small figure stumbling through the desert. Something about her desperate flight from the camp had touched a chord in his heart, perhaps because he recognized in her the same desperation he had felt when fleeing the massacre of his own family. "Water," Keiko whispered in English, the word barely audible through her cracked lips. Thomas knelt beside her and lifted a leather water pouch to her mouth, allowing her to drink slowly while supporting her head with his other hand. The cool liquid felt like salvation flowing down her parched throat, and for the first time in months she felt a spark of hope kindle in her chest. "You are far from the camp," Thomas said in careful English, his voice carrying the musical cadence of his native language. "Why do you run into the desert to die?" His question was direct but not unkind, spoken with the matter-of-fact acceptance of death that came from living in a land where survival was never guaranteed. Keiko struggled to sit up, her body trembling with the effort. "Better to die free than live as slave," she managed to say, her own English heavily accented but clear in its meaning. Thomas nodded slowly, understanding more than just her words. He saw in her eyes the same fierce determination that had driven his own people to fight impossible odds rather than accept defeat. "You are Japanese," he observed, having encountered other Asian immigrants during his travels through mining country. "Your people are far from this place, like mine once were everywhere in this land." There was no judgment in his voice, only the recognition of shared displacement and suffering. As they talked, Thomas learned Keiko's story, how she had been sold into labor, how she had endured months of abuse and near starvation, and how she had finally chosen death over continued enslavement. In return, she learned something of his own tragedy, though he spoke little of the pain that had driven him to live alone in the wilderness, surviving by his wits and the skills passed down through generations of Apache warriors. "I cannot take you back to my people," Thomas said finally. "They would not understand, and these are dangerous times for all Apache. But I will not leave you here to die." He stood and walked to his horse, returning with a bundle of supplies that represented a significant portion of his own survival resources. "There is a settlement 2 days' ride south," he continued, pointing toward a gap between distant mountains. "Mexican people, good people, who do not ask too many questions about the past. They will give you work and food if you are willing to earn them." He pressed the supplies into her hands, dried meat, cornmeal, and a full water pouch that would sustain her for the journey. But Keiko shook her head, her dark eyes meeting his with surprising strength. "I cannot walk 2 days. I will die before reaching this place." Her assessment was brutally honest. Her body had been pushed beyond its limits, and even with food and water, she lacked the physical strength to survive another grueling trek through the desert. Thomas studied her for a long moment, weighing options in his mind. He had lived as a solitary figure for 5 years, avoiding human contact except when necessary for trade or gathering information. Taking responsibility for another person would complicate his existence and potentially put them both in danger. Yet something about this small, determined woman reminded him of his own daughter, who would have been about Keiko's age if she had lived. "Then you will ride," he said finally, making a decision that surprised even himself. He whistled softly, and his paint horse trotted over, nuzzling his shoulder with obvious affection. "This is Wind Runner. He has carried me safely for many years, and will do the same for you." The offer was extraordinary. An Apache warrior's horse was often his most prized possession, representing not just transportation, but partnership and survival itself. Keiko stared at him in amazement. "I cannot take your horse. How will you survive in this place without him?" Her concern was genuine, recognizing the magnitude of his sacrifice, even through her weakened state. "I have survived worse losses," Thomas replied simply. "And Windrunner is getting old, like his rider. Perhaps it is time for both of us to find a different path." He helped her to her feet and supported her as she approached the horse, who stood calmly despite the presence of a stranger. As Thomas prepared to help Keiko mount the horse, he made another decision that would prove even more significant than giving her his most prized possession. "You will need a name that does not mark you as foreign," he said, adjusting the stirrups to accommodate her shorter legs. "In the settlement you will be known as Maria Crow Feather, my wife who survived the attack that killed our children." The false identity would provide protection in a land where Asian immigrants faced discrimination and violence, while the Apache name would explain any unusual features or mannerisms that might otherwise draw unwanted attention. More importantly, it would give her a connection to someone who understood survival against impossible odds. "Why do you help me?" Keiko asked, as Thomas secured the supply bundle behind the saddle. "You do not know me, and helping strangers in this place brings danger." Her question reflected the harsh reality of frontier life, where acts of kindness were often seen as weakness or foolishness. Thomas was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant as he considered her question. "My daughter would have been your age," he said finally. "Perhaps somewhere, someone showed kindness to her spirit when it needed help finding its way." His words carried the weight of grief and hope intertwined, suggesting a spiritual dimension to his generosity that transcended practical considerations. As the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the desert landscape, Thomas helped Keiko onto Windrunner's back. The horse accepted her weight without protest, as if understanding the importance of his new mission. Thomas handed her the reins and pointed once more toward the distant mountains. "Follow the dry creek bed until you reach the place where 3 rocks stand like sentinels," he instructed. "Then turn toward the setting sun until you see smoke from cooking fires. Tell them Thomas Crowfeather sent his wife to seek shelter among friends." His directions were precise, reflecting intimate knowledge of the terrain gained through years of survival in hostile territory. Before she rode away, Keiko reached into her small bundle and withdrew the only item of value she possessed, a delicate silver pendant that had belonged to her grandmother in Japan. "Please take this," she said, offering it to Thomas. "It is not much, but it carries the blessing of my ancestors. Perhaps it will bring you good fortune." Thomas accepted the pendant with the solemnity of someone who understood the significance of ancestral blessings. He hung it around his neck, where it joined other talismans and medicine objects that connected him to his own spiritual traditions. "I will treasure this gift," he said simply, "and I will remember the courage of the small woman who chose freedom over safety." As Keiko rode away across the desert, her slight figure gradually disappearing into the heat shimmer that rose from the sand, Thomas stood watching until she was completely out of sight. Then he turned and began walking north toward the mountains where he knew Apache war parties were gathering for what might be their final stand against the encroaching tide of American expansion. The transformation from Keiko Tanaka to Maria Crowfeather began with that ride across the Arizona desert, but it would be completed in the days and weeks that followed as she learned to navigate a new identity in a foreign land. The settlement Thomas had directed her to was called Esperanza, Hope, a name that proved prophetic for a woman who had nearly lost everything but found the strength to begin again. The settlement of Esperanza emerged from the desert like a mirage made real, its adobe buildings and cultivated fields a stark contrast to the harsh wilderness that surrounded it. As Windrunner carried Maria down the main street, curious faces appeared in doorways and windows, drawn by the sight of a lone woman on an Apache horse. The town had been founded by Mexican families fleeing the violence of their own civil wars, and they had learned to be cautious about strangers who arrived without warning. Maria's appearance told a story that needed no words. Her clothes were torn and dust-covered, her face gaunt from hunger and exposure, and her hands bore the unmistakable marks of hard labor. Yet there was something in her bearing, a quiet dignity that commanded respect even in her desperate state. When she dismounted in front of the small church that served as the town's spiritual center, her legs nearly buckled from exhaustion, but she managed to remain standing through sheer force of will. Father Miguel Hernandez emerged from the church, his weathered face creased with concern as he took in the sight of this unexpected visitor. He was a man in his 60s who had ministered to this frontier community for over 20 years, offering comfort and guidance to people who lived on the edge of survival. His eyes, kind but sharp with intelligence, quickly assessed Maria's condition and the quality of the horse she rode. "Señora, you are welcome here," he said in Spanish, then switched to English when he saw her confusion. "I am Father Miguel. You appear to be in need of assistance." His voice carried the gentle authority of someone accustomed to helping people in crisis, and Maria felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as she recognized genuine compassion in his manner. "I am Maria Crowfeather," she said, using the name Thomas had given her for the first time. The words felt strange on her tongue, but she spoke them with conviction, understanding that her survival depended on fully embracing this new identity. "My husband sent me here. He said you were good people who might help someone in need." Father Miguel's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of the Apache name, but his expression remained welcoming. The frontier had taught him that survival often required alliances that crossed cultural boundaries, and he had learned to judge people by their actions rather than their origins. "Thomas Crow Feather is known to us," he said carefully. "A man of honor who has helped our people in difficult times. Any wife of his is welcome in Esperanza." D. The priest's words revealed a history that Maria had not expected. Apparently, Thomas had maintained relationships with this Mexican community despite his isolation. Perhaps he had traded with them, or provided warnings about Apache raids, or simply offered assistance during times of crisis. Whatever the connection, it opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed to a stranger. Within hours of her arrival, Maria found herself in the home of Elena and Carlos Morales, a middle-aged couple whose own children had grown and moved away. Elena, a robust woman with graying hair and hands that spoke of decades of hard work, took one look at Maria's condition and immediately set about the task of nursing her back to health. Carlos, a skilled carpenter and farmer, offered practical assistance in the form of shelter and eventual employment. "You are safe here," Elena assured her as she prepared a bath of warm water, the first Maria had enjoyed in months. "But you must understand, life in Esperanza is not easy. We all work hard to survive, and everyone must contribute according to their abilities." Her words were not unkind, but they established clear expectations that Maria would need to earn her place in the community. The process of recovery was slow but steady. Elena's cooking, simple but nourishing, gradually restored some strength to Maria's wasted frame. The warm, dry climate of the settlement proved beneficial to her health, and the persistent cough that had plagued her in the mining camp began to subside. Most importantly, the absence of constant fear and abuse allowed her spirit to begin healing from the trauma she had endured. As her strength returned, Maria began to contribute to the household in whatever ways she could. Her small hands, so criticized by the miners, proved ideal for delicate work like mending clothes and preparing food. Elena taught her to make tortillas, to tend the vegetable garden, and to preserve meat for the long winter months ahead. In return, Maria shared knowledge from her homeland, techniques for growing rice in limited water, methods for preserving fish, and artistic skills that added beauty to practical objects. The transformation from Keiko to Maria required more than just adopting a new name. She had to learn new customs, new ways of speaking and moving, new relationships with the land and the people around her. The Mexican culture of Esperanza was different from both her Japanese heritage and the harsh Anglo world of the mining camps, offering a middle path that allowed her to retain some of her identity while adapting to new circumstances. Carlos proved to be an excellent teacher in practical matters. He showed her how to care for Windrunner, who had become not just transportation, but a symbol of her connection to Thomas and her new life. The horse seemed to understand his changed circumstances, adapting to life in the settlement while maintaining the alertness that had kept him alive in Apache territory. Under Carlos's guidance, Maria learned to ride properly, to understand the horse's moods and needs, and to appreciate the partnership that could exist between human and animal. "A horse like this is worth more than gold in this country," Carlos observed one evening as they groomed Windrunner together. "But I think Thomas Crow Feather knew that giving him to you was an investment in something more valuable than money." His words carried deeper meaning. The gift of the horse represented not just practical assistance, but a vote of confidence in Maria's ability to build a new life. As autumn deepened into winter, Maria's integration into the community accelerated. She proved to have a natural talent for languages, quickly becoming fluent in Spanish while maintaining her English and privately her Japanese. This linguistic ability made her valuable as a translator when traders or travelers passed through Esperanza, and it helped establish her reputation as an intelligent and useful member of the community. The winter months brought their own challenges and opportunities. The settlement's isolation increased as snow blocked many of the mountain passes, but this also created a sense of intimacy and mutual dependence among the residents. Maria participated in the communal activities that helped everyone survive the cold months. Storytelling sessions around evening fires, group projects like quilting and tool repair, and the careful rationing of food supplies to last until spring. It was during these long winter evenings that Maria began to share carefully edited versions of her own story. She spoke of growing up in a distant land across the ocean, of the journey to America in search of opportunity, and of the hardships she had faced before finding refuge in Esperanza. She never mentioned the mining camp or the circumstances of her escape, instead crafting a narrative that explained her presence, without revealing details that might compromise her safety or Thomas's. The community accepted her story without excessive questioning, understanding that many frontier residents carried secrets from their past. What mattered was her present behavior and her willingness to contribute to the collective welfare of Esperanza. By spring, she had become simply Maria, a valued member of the community whose foreign origins were acknowledged but not dwelt upon. The arrival of spring brought both hope and danger to the settlement. News filtered in from travelers and traders about increasing tensions between Apache tribes and the U.S. military, with reports of battles and massacres on both sides. The residents of Esperanza found themselves caught in the middle, trying to maintain neutrality while protecting their own interests and safety. It was during this tense period that Thomas Crow Feather reappeared in Maria's life, though not in the way either of them had expected. A wounded Apache warrior arrived at the settlement's outskirts one dawn, his horse near collapse, and his own condition critical from blood loss and infection. Father Miguel and Carlos brought him to the church, where they discovered that he carried a message specifically for Maria Crow Feather. The warrior, barely conscious from fever and pain, managed to whisper Thomas's name and indicate that he carried something important. In his medicine pouch, wrapped in soft leather, was Maria's grandmother's silver pendant, along with a brief note written in Thomas's careful English. "The woman who gave me this pendant brought honor to the name Crow Feather. If anything happens to me, she should know that her courage inspired an old warrior to find peace." The implications of the message were clear. Thomas was either dead or in mortal danger, and he had wanted Maria to know that their brief encounter had meant something significant to him. The wounded warrior, once his fever broke, provided more details about Thomas's fate. He had been captured during a military raid on an Apache camp, and while his ultimate destiny was unknown, the prospects for any Apache prisoner were grim. Maria's reaction to this news surprised even herself. The grief she felt was profound and immediate, as if she had lost a family member rather than someone she had known for only a few hours. Thomas had given her more than his horse and his name. He had given her a sense of worth and possibility at a moment when she had nearly given up hope. The thought that he might be suffering or dead because of his kindness to her was almost unbearable. "I must help him," she told Father Miguel and the Morales family that evening. "He saved my life, and if there is any way to return that favor, I have to try." Her declaration was met with concerned looks and gentle arguments about the impossibility and danger of such an undertaking. Apache prisoners were held at military forts hundreds of miles away, and even if Thomas was still alive, reaching him would require crossing hostile territory controlled by both the army and various Apache bands. But Maria's determination proved unshakable. Over the following weeks, she began to formulate a plan that combined her linguistic abilities, her new understanding of frontier culture, and the resources she had accumulated during her time in Esperanza. She would not attempt a dramatic rescue that would likely result in both their deaths, but she might be able to use legal and diplomatic channels to at least determine Thomas's fate and possibly secure his release. The plan required her to travel to Tucson, the territorial capital, where she could access military records and potentially contact officials with the authority to intervene in Thomas's case. It was a dangerous journey for a woman traveling alone, but Maria had advantages that most people lacked. She could pass for Mexican, Apache, or Asian depending on the circumstances, and her linguistic skills would allow her to navigate different cultural contexts as needed. Carlos and Elena initially opposed the plan, arguing that she would be throwing away the safety and stability she had worked so hard to achieve. But as they saw her determination and understood the depth of her gratitude to Thomas, they gradually shifted from opposition to support. If Maria was determined to make this journey, they would help her do it as safely as possible. The preparation took months, during which Maria saved every penny she could earn and gathered information about the route to Tucson and the military bureaucracy she would need to navigate. She practiced different personas and cover stories, learned to handle firearms for protection, and studied maps until she could navigate the territory blindfolded. Most importantly, she maintained her physical conditioning, knowing that the journey would test her endurance and survival skills. Windrunner would be her companion on this quest, carrying her across the same desert where Thomas had first saved her life. The horse seemed to sense the importance of their mission, displaying an alertness and energy that reminded Maria of his Apache training. Together, they would attempt something that most people would consider impossible, finding one man among the thousands of prisoners scattered across the American Southwest. As summer approached and Maria's departure date drew near, the entire community of Esperanza rallied to support her mission. Father Miguel provided letters of introduction to Catholic priests along her route. Carlos crafted special equipment for the journey, and Elena prepared food supplies that would sustain her for weeks in the wilderness. Even the children contributed, making small gifts and offering prayers for her success. The night before her departure, Maria stood alone with Windrunner under the vast canopy of desert stars, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than a year ago, she had been Keiko Tanaka, a broken slave dying in the Arizona desert. Now she was Maria Crow Feather, a free woman embarking on a quest to save the man who had made her transformation possible. "Tomorrow we begin the search," she whispered to the horse, stroking his neck as he nuzzled her shoulder. "We will find Thomas, or we will die trying. Either way, we will honor the gift he gave us." Windrunner whickered softly in response, as if he understood not just her words, but the commitment they represented. The quest that lay ahead would test everything Maria had learned about survival, courage, and the bonds that could form between strangers in the harsh landscape of the American frontier. Success was far from guaranteed, but the attempt itself represented a triumph over the forces that had tried to destroy her spirit. Whatever the outcome, she would face it as a free woman pursuing her own destiny, rather than a victim accepting whatever fate others imposed upon her. As dawn broke over Esperanza, painting the adobe buildings gold in the early light, Maria mounted Windrunner and rode out into the desert, carrying with her the hopes and prayers of an entire community. Behind her lay safety and stability, ahead lay uncertainty and danger. But for the first time since leaving Japan, she was traveling towards something she had chosen rather than running from something that had been forced upon her. The transformation from Keiko to Maria was complete, but the story of Maria Crow Feather was just beginning. In the vast expanse of the American Southwest, where cultures collided and survival depended on adaptability and courage, she would discover just how far determination and gratitude could carry a woman who refused to accept defeat. Her journey would take her through military forts and Apache territories, through Mexican villages and American settlements. following a trail of rumors and official records that might or might not lead to the man who had given her a second chance at life. Along the way, she would encounter others who had been displaced by the forces of expansion and conflict, and she would learn that her own story of survival and transformation was part of a larger tapestry of human resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. The desert stretched endlessly before her, but Maria no longer saw it as a place of death and despair. Instead, it had become the landscape of possibility, where a Japanese exile could become an Apache woman, where a dying slave could become a free person on a mission of mercy, and where the bonds of gratitude and compassion could transcend the boundaries of race, culture, and circumstance that seemed to divide the world into irreconcilable camps. Windrunner's hooves beat a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth, carrying them both toward an uncertain but self-determined future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, united by their connection to the man who had taught them both that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply refusing to abandon hope when all seems lost. Hey, my friends, help me by subscribing to the channel so we can reach 1,000 subscribers, even if you're watching from your TV or computer. Your subscription makes all the difference, and the algorithm will help you see more amazing stories. Leave a like or an emoji in the comments and be part of this growth.